My name is Glenn Woods. Thanks for joining me. And we're actually heading all the way down to Las Vegas right now, where Maureen Bader is on a 2-week sabbatical and joining the first question outside of the topic zone. Okay, Maureen?
Okay.
Okay, you just bought a house. You sure you want to go to Vegas?
Yeah, it's always a bit of a gamble, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking, unless you're trying to raise your next mortgage, I didn't think maybe it was a very good idea. I've just
well, I'm not really a gambler. I'm not much of a gambler, so
yeah.
I'm pretty busy here actually working.
I tried it once as a gambler. I actually did stand-up comedy for a while. I was on a gambling cruise ship, and I was bored out of my skull at the table, so I went over and sat next to an old lady by the slot machines, and she was just, I mean, so much fun. So I would much rather do that. But okay, you're down there on a working vacation. What are you doing?
Well, I'm down for 3 conferences. The first conference I'm attending, and that's where I am right now, is the Objectivist Conference. The Objectivist Conference is a gathering of people who really are interested in the theories of the philosophy of Ayn Rand. The next conference I'll go to is the Heartland Climate Change Conference, which is going to be, I'm sure, kind of funny because we're getting near record high temperatures here right now. Yesterday it got up to about 111 degrees.
Right.
I went to the Cirque du Soleil at 10 at night, and I walked back to the hotel at 12:30 in the morning, and it was still 96 degrees outside. So
yeah.
I guess maybe finally the government is actually delivering on its promise of global warming, because it certainly is warm here.
Well, wait a second. Is that warm in Nevada? I'm shocked. Yeah.
Because I hear it's pretty cold up in Wyoming.
Yeah, so, we're finally going to hit, on the 4th of July, we're finally going to hit 90 degrees. Other than that, with the whole time, well, you've been here, we've been in the 60s and 70s. So there's your global warming for you. So could you explain a little bit, though? I mean, I know exactly what the first conference you were talking about is, Objectivist, but what exactly is an objectivist for those people who don't know?
Okay, so objectivism is the philosophy of Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand was a Russian immigrant. She was born in 1905. She left Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1918, and she came to America because she believed that this was the freest place in the world. She ended up in Hollywood, in fact, and her very first job was working as an extra in a Cecil B. DeMille movie. She eventually went on to write screenplays, and then eventually went on to become a novelist and a very, very well-known philosopher. And the philosophy that she developed was called Objectivism. Of course, I think we talked a couple of weeks ago, or maybe last month, about some of the books that she had written. One was The Fountainhead. We, down at the Wyoming Liberty Group, had The Fountainhead as our first movie of our summer movie series, which was a story of it was a story of a man who lived by his principles. So this is essentially what Ayn Rand is doing in her novels. What The Fountainhead does is really flesh out the hero character and the villain character. So the hero characters are the ones who live on the basis of their principles, and they don't compromise. Because for Ayn Rand and in Objectivism, once you start to compromise, then you really are sort of selling out to the bad guys. Because if you think about it, what's the compromise between life and death?
Mm. Yeah.
And then she goes on then to write the Atlas Shrugged, and what Atlas Shrugged does is discuss more the effect of society on these heroic characters and on the villain characters. But essentially, and the other interesting thing, of course, about Atlas Shrugged is it's quite arguably one of the most influential philosophical novels ever written. And one of the things we've been talking about here at the conference is, when was the first time you read Atlas Shrugged, or when was the first time you read a novel of Ayn Rand, and what sort of turned you on to the objectivist philosophy. And a lot of people will say things like, well, somebody gave me The Fountainhead, or somebody gave me Atlas Shrugged, I read it, and it changed my life.
Right.
In my particular case, I had been working in the freedom movement since about 1991. I read The Fountainhead for the first time in 2005, and for me, I was sort of one of those, the other half, where essentially the philosophy of Atlas Shrugged, or the philosophy of Objectivism, really confirmed or affirmed a lot of the things I already believed.
Well, you and I are in the same boat there, because I read Atlas Shrugged in 2000. And it was exactly the same thing. She just reconfirmed for me everything that I already believed. Now, it is sort of a thick book and a lot to go through. But I have I've been saying this for years. There's three kinds of books. There's good books, which is just an easy, fast read, and you can blow through it in like a day, and that's fine because it's just entertaining. The second kind of book is a great book which entertains but also teaches you something maybe you didn't know, so it's entertaining and informative. Then there's exceptional books. The exceptional ones are like Atlas Shrugged. They're entertaining, they're informative, but also when you walk away from reading it, you're not the same person. You can't possibly be. And that's what I thought, to me, Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead both were.
That's right. And so I would certainly encourage people to, if they're not familiar with this work and they are interested in a philosophy that really provides the moral case for capitalism, and something we've been discussing here, which I think is very interesting for people in Wyoming, is the moral case for fossil fuels. I certainly would encourage them to take a look at this. So, in a nutshell, what objectivism is really about is the concept of man as a heroic being with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life, with productive achievement as his noblest activity, and reason as his only absolute. So before we go any farther on, we should probably mention the fact that this is actually a very controversial view.
Mm-hmm.
So not everybody thinks that man is a heroic being. He needs to live his life. His life needs to be the end of his activity. His life shouldn't be the means to the end of someone else's goals. This is very controversial, especially when we're thinking about what's going on today in society, where even in schools, children are taught you really need to live for other people. You need to sacrifice yourself for other people. And actually, one of the main contributions to philosophy that Ayn Rand did make was spelling out the evil of altruism.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about altruism, we're not talking about being nice to your neighbor. Altruism is a philosophy that really started with Immanuel Kant, and we can talk about that in a little bit, where instead of having, I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but instead of thinking of existence as the absolute, you've got consciousness as the absolute. So in other words, instead of thinking that existence exists, which is part of metaphysics, metaphysics is really the study of what is real. So for Ayn Rand, what was real was existence. But for other philosophers such as Kant, we can actually create reality with our own consciousness. And this was what she considered to be quite irrational. And this is actually a very controversial view, because more and more what we see today is this idea that we can just, what we want to, you get this relativism, what we want to be real is what can be real. And this actually leads to some very, very serious problems. So, but the objectivism is something that we can use as a tool for how to think about a lot of the controversies that we see all around us. So it's a full philosophical system. It includes metaphysics, which for Rand means objective reality. And as I mentioned, metaphysics is the study of the nature of reality. It asks, what is real?
Mm-hmm.
It also deals with epistemology, for Ayn Rand means reason. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, and it asks, how do we know? Now, ethics, this is probably where we get a little bit more controversial. Ethics, for Rand, means self-interest. Now, ethics is the area of philosophy which studies morality and essentially provides the principles that serve as the standard for life. And then the fourth arm of philosophy is politics, and that for Rand means the system that leads to the best outcomes for human beings, and for her, that is capitalism. So Ayn Rand says that if you held these concepts with total consistency as the base of your convictions, you would have a full philosophical system to guide the course of your life. But to hold them with total consistency, to understand, to define, to prove, and to apply them requires volumes of thought, which is why philosophy cannot be discussed while standing on one foot, nor while standing on 2 feet on both sides of the fence. This last is the predominant philosophical position today, particularly in the field of politics.
Well, now, something that also is a controversial, and you touched on it just a little bit there, but Ayn Rand is often accused of being selfish. Her philosophy is selfish. Well, great for her to come back with a book called The Virtues of Selfishness, which really just describes, I've always, to put it in a nutshell, as it's okay to think of yourself and to take care of yourself. And it's fine if you want to take care of other people, but that doesn't mean you have to sacrifice yourself in order to do it, or be worse yet, forced to sacrifice yourself in order to do it.
That's right. So in the idea of selfish, it's selfishness rightly understood, or rational egoism, as opposed to what she would consider to be irrational altruism.
Mm-hmm.
So your life is your highest standard. And you can see how that would be controversial,
right?
If for a religious person, for instance, because for a religious person, God would be the highest standard. But for Ayn Rand, your own life is your highest standard. And so what she shows in her novels, you've got the characters of Howard Rourke or John Galt. What they're doing is living to sort of maximize their happiness in life by productive work. So in Objectivism, you've got their three main values, which would be reason, purpose, and self-esteem. And through working towards achieving these values, you are actually working towards making your own life happy, because that is essentially your highest moral purpose in life. Now, again, this is pretty controversial. Not everyone is necessarily going to agree with that, but it is certainly something to think about. If you put your life first, and you're not sacrificing yourself or compromising the people that would perhaps have you sacrifice your life to their own goals, then you're likely going to be much happier, because you're going to live a much more virtuous life. Because for Ayn Rand, you have virtues such as independence, and what we see today, especially as we move towards a more collectivist system, even here in the United States, you have the government that is really encouraging people to live in a dependent manner. So they expand the welfare state, the welfare system, always encouraging you to perhaps, take food stamps when really you probably shouldn't. And you can't really blame people in a way, because, generally speaking, I think people are looking for pretty easier ways to live, and unfortunately they get encouraged to live in these ways that generally will work against their achievement of happiness, which is actually really it's really taking us down the wrong road right now.
Let me explain something to you. I was just talking to everybody about this in the last half hour of the program, but I think you need to hear this and apply it to where you are right now and what you're learning at these conferences. So in Berkeley, California, of course, they have a lot of stores that do medical marijuana. Well, and of course, most of those stores aren't necessary. There's more stores than people who actually would need the stuff. And there's more prescriptions being handed out than people who actually have a need for it. And so the genius people at the city of Berkeley, California, are considering a law that would say if a poor person walks in and has a prescription and they can't pay for it, well, then the store has to give them free medical marijuana and the good stuff. And it suddenly dawned on me, Maureen, we're taking a step beyond taxes here. See, before, government used to come along and tax you and then use that money to help the poor. Now, they weren't asking for the money. They took it from you. And then they went to start a program to help the poor. This would open up the door for government just to turn and say, there's some poor people out there, and if they come into your store and want something, you have to give it to them directly or else, which, of course, takes the whole tax system out of play. But aren't you being forced to be compassionate? And, of course, that means that wouldn't be compassionate.
No, that's just institutionalizing theft, basically.
Yeah,
so instead of walking in and so essentially people can just walk in and take your stuff.
Yeah.
Right? And that, that's the height, essentially that's the height of the welfare state, that's the height of altruism, and that's the direction, unfortunately, that we're moving in. It's just really mind-boggling that you'd have politicians, or these kind of politicians could get, well, it's not mind-boggling that they could get continuously voted into office, because essentially in fact, we discussed a little bit about the nature of democracy and the problems with democracy, and what you have with democracy is majority rule, and essentially what you have, and what you were seeing here in this particular example, is this idea that if you've got a large group of people, they can impose their will on others and force others to sacrifice for them. So you've got these store owners who are forced to work more so that these other people can work less, and that's just fundamentally wrong. And if we don't turn that around and move back towards a capitalist system where we've got trade for mutual benefit, I've got something that you want, you've got something that I want, and we make an exchange that we freely and voluntarily agree upon. If we don't start moving back in that direction, we're in really, really serious trouble. And the sort of, we keep on, even through the courses that we have here at the conference, it is a little bit depressing because you can see the way things are moving, and that's, your example is a real good one. I mean, that sort of thing has just got to stop. Otherwise, it's the end of the republic.
Geeks look at the Objectivist Convention and go, "Oh Lord!" But apparently, it's a good time to people like you and I. So, what do you plan to take away from something like this? Were you looking for something when you went down there?
Well, it's in fact, I've met some really interesting people down here. One is George Selgin. George Selgin is an economics professor at the University of Georgia. He has just recently been hired by the Cato Institute, and one of the things I wanted to mention also is that John Allison, who is the new president and CEO of the Cato Institute, and I think he's also still the president and CEO of the BB&T. So it was a bank that was, I think it's still around, that didn't have any problems and didn't take any government bailout when the government was really starting to ramp up the financial regulations. The interesting thing about George Selgin, and I had another talk with him, is that I had actually used a lot of the work that he had done in a paper that I wrote for the South African Journal of Economic History on free banking. One of the things that we hear a lot, and I agree with, is that we've got to get rid of the Federal Reserve System. Unfortunately, when people talk about getting rid of the Federal Reserve System, they're not talking about what we would do instead. And that's a big mistake, because we do need to get rid of the Federal Reserve, but what we need to do is educate people about what the actual alternative is and what existed before and why the Federal Reserve is so bad. Because I don't know if a lot of people realize this, but the Federal Reserve System has only been around since 1913. Now, the United States never had free banking, but free banking started in Scotland back in probably the 1600s sometime, and it actually went all around the world, and it existed. We had free banking in Canada, and what free banking does is essentially what you have is competitive currency. So you've got a number of different banks, which in Canada most of the time was somewhere between 5 and 10. You've got a branch banking system, which is one of the main strengths of the Canadian banking system. You have now the ability of the money supply to increase and decrease depending on the demand for money, which, of course, during the main free banking time in Canada was determined primarily by the harvest season. So one of the things that I think we need to start talking about is what existed in terms of efficient banking systems prior to this worldwide conversion of countries from free banking to central banking, and how the central bank, or the Federal Reserve System here in the United States, has not made recessions worse.
Right.
Has in fact made recessions worse when the whole purpose supposedly was to sort of smooth out these recessions. So that's something that I think has been really quite useful here. And I really encourage people to find out more about objectivism and take a look at some of these books if they have an opportunity.
Okay, running out of time on the clock. Maureen, I'm looking forward to your book report on this. There will be an open book quiz. All right.
Yeah, I can send you a list.
All right. Thanks. Good. Thanks for calling in, too. Appreciate it.
Okay, we'll talk to you next week. Bye now.